My name is Miller Files. I have spent most of my career chasing noise, gunshots, screams, witnesses talking over each other. Chaos leaves fingerprints. Silence does not. The cases they call the Chicago Strangler are silent cases. There is no official file with that title. No task force photo. No press conference where a captain stands behind a podium and promises answers. What exists instead are dozens of individual homicide reports filed over years, sometimes decades, each one closed or left unresolved, each one treated as a separate tragedy. But when I laid them side by side, something else began to emerge. Chicago is a city that knows violence. It wears it like weather. Some days are colder than others. Some nights are louder. But what drew my attention were not the shootings that made headlines. It was the deaths that barely earned a paragraph. Women found in alleys. Women discovered in abandoned buildings. Women who died without anyone calling their name on the evening news. The first file I opened was unremarkable by itself. Female victim, adult. Found deceased. Cause of death listed as asphyxiation. No suspect, no witnesses, no follow-up. I would have closed it myself years ago. But then I opened the next file and the next, different addresses, different years, different detectives, same ending. Asphyxiation, manual strangulation, ligature strangulation, no gunshots, no knives, no frenzy. Just hands or fabric or pressure applied long enough to end the life quietly. Strangulation is personal. It requires proximity. It requires time. You do not strangle someone by accident. You do not do it in a hurry, and you do not do it without watching the life leave their body. That is when the word pattern started to form in my mind. Patterns are dangerous things. They can reveal truth, or they can trick you into seeing connections that are not there. That is why law enforcement is cautious. That is why Chicago has never officially declared a serial killer in these cases. But caution has a cost. The women in these files shared more than a cause of death. They shared invisibility. Many were poor. Many were women of color. Some were homeless. Some struggled with addiction. Some survived by moving through the city at night, unseen by most, remembered by few. When they disappeared, no one filed a missing persons report immediately. Sometimes no one filed one at all. By the time their bodies were found, days or weeks later, the trail had gone cold. In a city this big, silence is camouflage. I mapped the locations, south side, west side, areas where abandoned buildings outnumber streetlights, places where a scream dissolves into distance. The map did not form a neat circle or a straight line. It formed a scatter that made sense only if you understood how Chicago breathes. If there is one thing a predator learns, it is rhythm. When people are out, when they are not. When police patrols pass, when they do not, the person or people behind these deaths understood that rhythm. What troubled me most was not what was present in the files, but what was missing. No DNA that tied cases together, no repeated fibers, no consistent signature beyond the act itself, nothing clean enough to force the system to look again, and so each case stayed alone. But killers do not think in isolation. Systems do. By the end of that first week, my desk was covered in reports that officially had nothing to do with each other. Unofficially, they were starting to speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough that I could no longer ignore them. This was not about proving the existence of a monster. It was about asking whether the city had learned to look away. And once a city learns that, it becomes very hard to teach it to look back. In my line of work, you learn quickly that the dead are not the hardest part. The hardest part is the people no one looks for. When a body is found, the city reacts. There is a report, a coroner, a case number, but everything that matters happens before that moment. The hours when someone does not come home, the days when a phone stops ringing, the weeks when a name should be spoken but is not. Most of the women in these files vanished quietly. No Amber Alerts, no missing person flyers taped to streetlights, no press conferences pleading for tips. In many cases, there was not even a formal report filed when they disappeared. Some were noticed only after their bodies were discovered. Some were identified by fingerprints because no one came forward to claim them. That is not an accident. That is a condition. Chicago has thousands of people who live in motion. They sleep in different places. They change phone numbers. They drift between shelters, couches, streets, and strangers. For many of the women I studied, disappearance was not immediately alarming because instability was already part of their lives. If you miss a doctor's appointment, someone calls. If you miss work, someone notices. If you miss a shift at survival, no one does. This is where the predator enters the picture. A killer who targets people with roots leaves evidence behind, a trail of panic. Family members asking questions, employers demanding answers, media pressure, police urgency. A killer who targets people without anchors leaves almost nothing. Several of the women had histories of addiction. Some were involved in survival sex. Some were homeless. Some moved between abusive relationships and temporary refuge. Their lives were already categorized as chaotic long before they were murdered. And chaos is convenient. In multiple cases, the last confirmed sightings were vague. A woman seen walking with an unknown man. A woman leaving a convenience store. A woman entering a building she had entered before and never leaving again. No names, no license plates, no cameras that worked. No one who felt responsible enough to remember details. When I interviewed outreach workers and shelter staff years later, the same sentence came up again and again. She stopped coming around. In a city like Chicago, that sentence can mean anything. It can mean someone got clean. It can mean someone moved on. Or it can mean someone is dead in a building no one checks anymore. By the time police connected a body to a name, the timeline was already broken. Days or weeks unaccounted for. Contacts gone cold. Witnesses scattered or deceased themselves. From an investigative standpoint, this is where cases go to die. What haunted me was not just who these women were, but how predictable their vulnerability was. Anyone paying attention could see it. Anyone patient enough could exploit it. If there is a Chicago Strangler, this is his hunting ground. The question that followed me through this phase of the investigation was not why these women were targeted. It was why the city allowed them to be. The system did not fail loudly. It failed quietly, repeatedly, and without consequence. Each disappearance treated as an unfortunate but expected outcome of a difficult life. Each death absorbed into statistics that no longer shocked anyone. When I reread the files with that understanding, the pattern became clearer. Not just a pattern of killing, but a pattern of neglect. And neglect is the perfect cover. Violence tells a story even when the killer never speaks. In these cases, the story begins at the throat. I spent weeks reviewing autopsy reports. Not summaries, not conclusions. Every measurement, every note written by medical examiners who had no idea their words might one day be read together. Alone, each report felt clinical. Together, they began to breathe. Strangulation is not efficient. It is not quick. It takes minutes longer than people imagine. Minutes where pressure must be maintained. Minutes where the victim resists. Minutes where the person applying that pressure has time to stop. That is the detail most people miss. Whoever did this chose not to stop. Some victims showed petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. Some had bruising consistent with hands. Others showed marks consistent with fabric or clothing, used as a ligature. There was variation, but the outcome was the same: air denied, consciousness fading, death arriving quietly. This was not rage exploding. This was control sustained. From an investigative standpoint, strangulation often points to familiarity or opportunity. It suggests proximity without immediate resistance. It suggests a setting where screams are unlikely to be heard or ignored if they are. Alleys, abandoned buildings, empty apartments, places where violence does not interrupt daily life because daily life has already left. What complicated the picture was inconsistency. Not every case looked identical. Some victims were partially clothed. Others were not. Some showed signs of sexual assault. Others did not. Some were left in plain view. Others were concealed. This is where many serial killer theories collapse. Popular culture teaches us to expect signatures, rituals, predictable behaviors. But real-life killers adapt. They make mistakes. They change tactics when circumstances demand it. The absence of a clean signature does not mean the absence of a single offender. It may mean intelligence, or it may mean there is no single offender at all. I had to confront that possibility head-on. Chicago has no shortage of violent men. It has no shortage of predators who target vulnerable women. It is entirely possible that these deaths represent multiple unrelated crimes that look similar because the environment produces similar outcomes. Strangulation is quiet. It requires no weapon. It leaves fewer ballistic clues. For someone operating on the margins of society, it is the simplest way to kill without drawing attention. If that is the case, then the Chicago Strangler is not a person. It is a pattern created by poverty, neglect, and opportunity. But patterns do not fully explain repetition. When I aligned timelines, I noticed clusters, periods where similar deaths occurred within weeks of each other, then long gaps. That kind of rhythm suggests a life that intrudes and retreats. Employment, incarceration, hospitalization, movement. It suggests one or very few individuals whose circumstances changed. Another detail bothered me. Several scenes showed no evidence of robbery, no missing valuables, no frantic disturbance. If the motive was purely opportunistic violence, there would be chaos. Instead, there was restraint. Restraint is intention. Whoever applied that pressure understood exactly how much was needed. Not too fast, not too slow. Enough to end resistance without leaving a spectacle. That level of control is learned. I began to wonder where someone might learn it. Prisons, street violence, domestic abuse, any environment where power is enforced physically and repeatedly. If there is a Chicago Strangler, he is not impulsive. He is practiced. But here is the most unsettling truth I reached during this phase. Whether there is one killer or many matters less than we think, because the outcome is the same. Women died quietly. Cases stayed separate. No one was held accountable. The system is built to catch patterns that are loud, gunshots, spikes. Public fear. What it struggles to catch are crimes that blend into the background noise of neglect. A killer who strangles in silence does not need to be brilliant. He only needs to be ignored. And Chicago has perfected the art of ignoring what does not demand attention. Every investigation depends on memory, not the memory of witnesses, but the memory of the system itself. In Chicago, memory is stored in file rooms. I walked through them more times than I can count. Long corridors, metal shelves, cardboard boxes stamped with years that no longer mean anything to anyone. Inside those boxes are lives reduced to paperwork. Dates, addresses, causes of death. Case numbers that once felt urgent and now collect dust. This is where patterns go to disappear. Each homicide is assigned a number, a district, a detective. That structure is supposed to bring order. But when crimes stretch across years and neighborhoods, that same structure becomes a wall. Files do not talk to each other unless someone forces them to. No one forced them to hear. One woman strangled in the South Side is a case for one unit. Another woman strangled months later in the West Side belongs to another. Different supervisors, different priorities, different levels of pressure. On paper, they are unrelated. In reality, they may share the same hands. But paper does not ask questions. Chicago is a city under constant triage. Every day brings new shootings, new bodies, new emergencies. Detectives are taught to move fast, clear cases, move on. A homicide without witnesses, without a cooperative family, without immediate attention sinks quickly on the priority list. Cold cases are not failures in the moment. They become failures over time. I spoke with retired detectives who worked some of these scenes years ago. Most remembered the frustration. Few remembered the details. They had moved on because the system demanded it. New cases arrived before the old ones could breathe. No centralized unit ever owned these deaths. No analyst was assigned to look across decades. No mandate existed to ask whether silence itself was a clue, and so the files stayed separate. Technology advanced. Databases improved. DNA backlogs shrank. But these cases fell into the gap between eras. Too old for modern tools, too thin for renewed effort. When no one is demanding answers, there is no incentive to ask harder questions. What troubled me most was how normal this felt to everyone involved. The fragmentation was not a scandal, it was procedure. Each detective did their job within their box. No one stepped outside it. If there was a Chicago Strangler, he did not defeat the system. He simply waited for it to defeat itself. The city never made a decision to stop looking. It simply never made a decision to start looking together. By the time the idea of a pattern surfaced publicly, years had passed. Witnesses were gone. Buildings demolished, records incomplete. The past had sealed itself. This is how killers survive institutions, not by being smarter, but by being patient. A system designed to respond to crisis will always miss slow violence. And strangulation is slow violence. Every investigation ends the same way, not with an answer, but with a decision about what to do when the answer never comes. I have chased killers who wanted to be caught. Men who left messages. Men who needed an audience. Men who escalated until the city had no choice but to see them. This case was never like that. The Chicago Strangler does not announce himself. He does not taunt the police. He does not demand recognition. If he exists as a single person, his greatest weapon has never been violence. It has been patience. Years passed between deaths that looked alike enough to raise suspicion, yet different enough to dissolve it. Neighborhoods changed. Detectives retired. Buildings were torn down. Files moved from desk to storage, from storage to silence. Time did the work a killer usually has to do himself. When people ask me whether I believe the Chicago Strangler is real, I hear a different question underneath. They are asking whether the horror has a face, because if it has a face, it can be hunted. If it has a name, it can be charged. If it has a body, it can be stopped. But what if it does not? What if the Chicago Strangler is not one man, but a gap? A space where responsibility disappears. A shadow formed by neglect, poverty, indifference, and exhaustion. That possibility frightens me more than any single killer ever could, because a man can be arrested, a system cannot. I think about the women whose names fill these files. Not how they died, but how they lived. How many times they were ignored before the night they were killed. How many warnings went unheard because the people sending them did not speak loudly enough for the city to listen. If there was one moment when this case could have turned, it was not at a crime scene. It was earlier. When the first woman disappeared and no one searched. When the second died and no one connected it. When the third followed and the city shrugged. Patterns do not start with violence. They start with permission. Permission to look away. Permission to accept loss as inevitable. Permission to believe that some lives matter less. Whether there was one Chicago Strangler or many no longer feels like the right question. The right question is how many times this city allowed someone to kill without consequence. As I close this file, I am left with no arrest to announce. No resolution to offer. Only a record of what happens when silence outlasts outrage. If you are listening to this hoping for closure, I cannot give it to you. Real investigations do not always end with justice. Sometimes they end with memory, and memory is fragile. The danger is not that this happened once. The danger is that it can happen again. Somewhere in Chicago tonight, a woman is walking alone. Somewhere nearby, someone knows she will not be missed immediately. And somewhere in the system, another file waits to be created. That is not a story about a monster. That is a story about us,